this webinar really emerged out of discussions in early June after the horrific death of George Floyd in Minneapolis at the hands of police, and the protests that that erupted around the world. We were talking about it in the School of Journalism. Shirley Staples Carter, our Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion and Diversity, all three items, really, I think, was eager for us to take a role in at least some part of this, try to figure out what's going on in America. So in connecting with Xavier, I said, I think I can persuade my old state newspaper colleague, Allison Askins, to join us and talk about the coverage of religion and race that we attempted to do in the late 90s, 2000s, and she was there until 2008, and I was there until 2015. She agreed with a little arm twisting, and we aimed to, of course, not tell everything we ever covered, but we wanted to examine the intersection of faith, politics, and civil rights, and also look at what we may have missed as America is grappling with systemic racism and police brutality. So we've picked out some examples of writing that we did and sort of the struggle we went through to get these stories to the printed page back then. That's what we really were dealing with, not the web. And maybe help you all sort of see inside our brains a little bit and how journalism works. And it's very messy, and sometimes we get it right and sometimes we get it wrong. And I think for us, particularly as two white reporters, we have talked about it a lot, and I hope that this will be informative, and we really want you all to ask us questions and we can take it on. So I'll turn it over to Allison to introduce herself and talk a little bit about how she got in the news business.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Carolyn. Yes, she did twist my arm a tad, but I'm always glad to do some work again with Carolyn. So I came to the state newsroom in 1996 after having worked for 3 other South Carolina newspapers and one religious press publication, which was the South Carolina United Methodist Advocate. I had known of the Advocate during my coverage of religion at other papers. They had a strong history of working in for civil rights, and I really admired that. So when an opening came up there after I finished my master's here at USC, I decided to move into take an opportunity to work for the religious press. And I will say I learned probably more than ever about race relations, about increasing my understanding of racism in that job because of the diversity of the United Methodist Church in South Carolina. I had always been interested in the diversity of faiths. I grew up what I would call sort of a textile brat. I moved around throughout my growing up to many different small textile towns. And my mother, fortunately, was a person who always valued people who weren't like us and encouraged me to get to know these people who weren't just like us. And as an example, what I can tell you is when we lived in Milledgeville, Georgia for 2.5 years, I was strongly encouraged to get to know our neighbors across the street who were a Jewish family. I went to synagogue with them. I had sleepovers with their daughter, and we would sneak matzah crackers in the middle of the night. So I was encouraged to get to know people and where they were from, and that stuck with me. And so when I later moved into journalism as a career, it was very natural for me to want to understand people who were not just like everybody else. And so And I had just a deep interest in that. So I brought all that with me and joined Carolyn in the state newsroom in 1996. So Carolyn.
All right, I'll explain how I got there and to sit side by side with Allison. I came to the state in 1994 as an editor. I came from my native Virginia, where I had worked at United Press International covering the state house politics, governor's races, and had gone to the Roanoke Times and World News, where I covered health and medicine. At UPI, we were sort of heirs to what I would call this folks who had covered the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, and they were very vocal about what it was like and how dangerous it was. And they really, even more than the Associated Press, I think they really focused on it in the early days. And then both wire services were really dedicated to that. So I liked the, and I think Allison always calls it the rough draft of history perspective, what Ben Bradley says that's what we should be doing to try to put our coverage in historical perspective and understand where we are in terms of modern life and history behind it. I've always been intrigued by the intersection of faith and politics in the public square. And I was committed to covering civil rights and illuminating voices that had not been really heard before. Interestingly, right before Allison arrived at the state, I had asked to be to cover poverty and race, and at the time, we just did not have the funding, or there was not enough impetus to do that. So when the executive editor asked if I could join Allison on this team of writers, he agreed that we could also cover issues of civil rights when it crossed with religion. So we were able to do a lot of things, maybe not so much under the banner of religion, but we were able to look at South Carolina in different ways.
And I point out this picture at the top of this slide. This was a moment where Carolyn and I just couldn't believe we were standing in the photography studio having our picture taken. They were promoting us as a team across the city on billboards, and that was not the kind of journalism we were used to. We were not self-promoters. We were used to being a byline on the page and preferring to stay that way. A very different world than where you are today, and you brand yourself in your work. So we kind of chuckle about this picture, but it's a nice memento.
That would be considered social media of the 1990s, right there. We got one picture, 2 billboards, I think, in the city.
And we got named the church chicks in the newsroom because of it. So,
yes. Yes.
Okay, we're going to move over and let you give you kind of a picture of the newsroom we came into. In 1996, when I came to work for the state, I walked into this huge newsroom of over 150 reporters, editors, and designers. It was by far the largest newsroom I had ever worked in. And I literally went home and told my husband I felt like maybe I had landed at NASA. It felt that big to me. And there was that much energy in the room. It was palpable. Everybody was in their little pod, working, talking. It was a fabulous experience. I loved my time there. The newsroom was about 10% minority. The goal had been to work towards mirroring the minority population in South Carolina, which would have been more like 30%. But that was very difficult to do, even with Knight Ridder minority initiatives. Knight Ridder owned the paper at the time. Really, it was hard to bring minorities to Columbia, South Carolina, when they could go to many other more interesting cities. And so we never reached that goal, even though it was the desire. We were evenly split, male and female, though probably more male editors in the upper editing jobs. And we were part of a really unique thing going on in this newsroom of team-based reporting, where we were working together as teams on different subject matters. And Carolyn and I were on a really fun team that looked at a variety of different issues, and she and I were the ones looking at religion or faith values and civil rights. So I'm going to let her tell you how that evolved.
So when I entered the newsroom, and this was fascinating to me, the editors had done some research and held some focus groups about reader interest in the community. And two of the top hobbies or avocations were gardening and Bible reading. So the editors knew that these issues ought to be covered, and so we did a lot on gardening, but we also needed to examine faith and what that meant in the community. From my perspective, coming from Virginia to South Carolina, one of the things that I got asked a lot is, do you have a church home? And that really, to me, that didn't happen a lot when I was covering issues in Virginia. So that really made me realize that in many ways, church was home in South Carolina, and people really valued their experience on Wednesday nights, Sundays, Saturdays, Fridays, whenever they worshiped. Our executive editor wanted to have two reporters covering this, which was highly unusual for a newsroom of our size. And he said, I want religion to show up on page 1, not just in a section on Friday. For those of you who probably have not picked up an actual printed paper in a long time, most of you, I suspect, get your news off your phones or digitally. We had dedicated sections, and Friday was our day, and Allison and I had to scramble to fill that every week, not to mention breaking news about spirituality, religion and politics had to go out on the front page.
And we wanted very much for that section not to just be profiles on churches. We wanted it to be have more context than that, more texture than that, and not to just be Christian, because we knew there weren't just Christians in this community. And we wanted to help people understand how faith worked in a person's life. I remember one time, for example, just to give you a quick example, always in the holidays, it was hard to find unique stories that weren't trite. But I remember one story in particular, Carolyn, you may remember it, where members of other faith groups beyond Christian pitched in jobs in hospitals and police work and things like that, so the Christian employees could have Christmas off. And so these were the kinds of stories we wanted to tell, where people could really understand how faith crossed with the culture.
And I think Allison had a great gift of developing sources, which reporters live and die by their sourcing and who is going to tell them what's going on in a community. And Allison came in committed to hearing from Roman Catholics, Baha'is, Wiccans, Jews. So we wanted to know and recognize and understand people in synagogues, in mosques, and in churches.
And before we're going to move into some stories now, but I do want to just make one other little note too that I meant to mention in the very beginning. This large newsroom of 150, I would suspect we would be lucky if that's 30 now. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we progress in this conversation, because there are many things you cannot do with only 30 people. So, okay, now we're going to go to our first story. This story occurred 1 week after I had been in the newsroom. I'm going to read you the first few paragraphs so you can get a sense of it. The headline, "Let All Old Wars Die Out. 100 Pastors Call for Healing, Reconciliation on Battle Flag." They came in clerical collars, business shirts, suits, skirts, and sweaters. They came from the Low Country to the Upstate, the PD to the Midlands. and if they could not come, they sent letters. A racially and theologically diverse group of clergy stood more than 100 strong Thursday and urged people of faith to put aside their feelings about the Confederate battle flag and pray for a way to bring racial healing to South Carolina. The group gathered at Trinity Cathedral in Columbia. They stopped short of offering any solutions, but voiced support for Governor David Beasley's desire to bring about racial reconciliation. So this story puts the Confederate battle flag right in the cross-section of faith, values, and the public square. It was the first time that Black and white pastors met publicly on the issue and showed solidarity. Reverend Dick Lincoln, David Beasley's pastor, Shandon Baptist Church, launched the news conference encouraging racial reconciliation. It was fascinating to see all those people gathered in, I believe it's Satterley Hall at Trinity. So many different faces, and very determined that this needed to change. I think what we got right in this was that we gave a voice to this growing interracial movement that understood that the Confederate battle flag was harming the state, harming its people spiritually and emotionally, and had been and was part of a bigger story in that too. I will say that the Black pastors who were there expressed some concern about the restrained tone of the statement, but they were there because they knew they needed to be there in the hope that this could truly bring about change. I'm going to let Carolyn talk to you about what we may have missed.
So as Allison and I were thinking about this story, which was very, it was a moment, I think, in the newsroom for us, and it made us recognize that Blacks, we were missing something about the fervor which with Black South Carolinians wanted that flag down and what it represented. The Confederate battle flag had flown on the dome of the State House since 1962, and the question of how long it was to have flown, it was part of the centennial of the Civil War, was never answered, and people just let it stay up. And so there had been this movement through the decades. Why is it still up? What does it represent? And for Black pastors and leaders, it represented stay in your place. You know where you belong. Now, in the 90s, there was still a huge push for the flag representing heritage among white South Carolinians, who, particularly if they had had a ancestor who fought in the war. So there was this definite clash, but we may have highlighted more of the heritage through the years at the newspaper, and I know we did. And now, as this was bubbling up with Governor Beasley's call for removal of the flag, it really launched a new war, I guess. The old war, the old Civil War, they were trying to put in the past, but this became a new war.
And it took 4 years from the day of this press conference to get that flag off the dome. So once again, patience, grace, you know, in looking back, you just marvel at the patience of the fight. But 4 years to get it off the dome, and then 15 years more until it came off the State House grounds due to the absolute tragic slaying at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston.
And Allison, I think we want to remind people too that when it came off the dome in 2000, really the only reason it came off was because there was a compromise that the flag, the battle flag, would flutter at the Confederate Soldier Monument, which faces It's directly in front of the State House. And many black lawmakers did not like that compromise because it basically was, the flag was really in your face when it was at the soldier monument. So even after 2000, there was this constant tension. NAACP continued to have a boycott of the state, encouraging people not to hold conferences, sports events here. And I always remember a conversation I had with Lonnie Randolph, who was at the time the state director of the NAACP and had really done a marvelous job of gathering people together. He, at King Day at the Dome, marches in January, there was a huge outpouring of support for taking the flag down. So in conversation with him one day, I said, well, Lonnie, you've got what you wanted. It's off the dome. You know, take a break, relax. And he said, no, ma'am, I am not going to relax until that flag is off the monument. And I have often thought of that was me speaking from my white perspective, that, you know, dust off your hands and just say, okay, if the compromise works, it's okay. He was not willing to compromise.
And I think probably this is going to show some advocacy journalism, which was not our form of journalism, but I think the state is better for that having happened and people having the push that they did. Okay, let's move to the next slide, which is about a crusade by evangelist Tony Evans out of Dallas, Texas. I'm going to read to you the first few graphs of this. Crusade highlights religion's need to include all. There was a moment during the Tony Evans crusade when the Dallas evangelist began to step from his message of Christian unity and into South Carolina's murky political waters. As his booming voice echoed across Williams-Brice Stadium, Evans brought up the one issue that has vexed politicians from Governor David Beasley on down: the flying of the Confederate battle flag atop the State House. But if there were people in the crowd who expected or wanted a political answer, Evans wasn't about to provide one. It doesn't matter. You leave it up, you take it down, because we are going to live for God, said Evans, head of one of the largest Black congregations in the country and the first Black to earn a doctorate from Dallas Theological Seminary. So this story occurs about a year later, after a group of interracial evangelical leaders come to the newsroom to meet with the executive editor to express concern about not feeling as if they had been heard, and this desire for racial healing in the state. And the editors decided that this was an important story for us to cover, and encouraged extensive coverage. We did a large special section that did a profile on Tony Evans before he came, on these leaders in the community and what they were about. It was on par with the Billy Graham crusade. And I think one of the things that we got right about it was listening to evangelicals who felt like maybe they had not been heard in the same way in the local media as other mainline denominations. Mainline denominations didn't particularly like that we were giving this much coverage to this event. It was kind of post Jim Baker and Jerry Falwell. They were well in the public square at that point, but the stereotype of the evangelical, I think, is what we were aiming to move a bit away from, so that people might understand the work these people were doing. And I will say these were the people who were rolling up their sleeves and doing really hard work. They were not just paying lip service to their faith. And I'm going to let Carolyn talk to you about what we may have missed again. So Carolyn.
Well, as we have thought about this, well, really in the midst of it, I think Allison and I felt we were overdoing it. We were a little uncomfortable that we were on the front page of the paper for about 4 days in a row. And, you know, normally you're striving to be on page one, but I think we probably felt like we were giving this way too much coverage. However, that said, talking about Billy Graham was, you know, a person of stature in South Carolina. People loved him. He had come for crusades on several, I think 3 occasions, including one in the 50s when he was not allowed to have a crusade on the State House grounds because he wanted to have an integrated crusade. So he refused that and moved it to a place where he could have integrated crowds. So there was a history and legacy of reporting on crusades. But then we've thought about this sort of disconnect in the evangelical community that left issues to God rather than deciding them in the public square. This, I think, really goes back. I always think about President Bill Clinton, who said, you know, we are allowed, it's not freedom from religion, it's freedom of religion. And so therefore people should be able to have conversations and make decisions in the public square. This particular group of evangelical leaders did not want to do that. And I've always wondered what the conversation in the back room was with Tony Evans on this, because I'm sure it was spirited. And again, looking today to the sway of evangelicals in the public square, it's huge. In South Carolina, the Christian Coalition was very powerful here. So evangelicals did have a say, and they were wielding it at points, but this was one moment where they did not.
Yeah, yeah. And I think there is some, well, you've stressed it on the kind of the cognitive dissonance, the chord that doesn't quite, that people sometimes have a hard time understanding this. We'll leave it to God, when the question I often have is, okay, then who does it? If we're leaving it to God, how does it get done? And are we not people of God? How does it get done? But anyway, so it's just an interesting question to ponder as you work through all the complicated issues of public life. I'm going to switch to another. Are you okay, well, Carolyn, ready?
I just wanted to say one thing, that we were able, through this group of evangelical leaders, however, we sourced a lot of other stories that were very important in the community. So I think it was an important set of stories to do, and we were able to build our coterie of other stories.
Yeah, yes, definitely. Okay, our next story, Carolyn's going to start off for you and share with you the beginning of this one.
All right. This was a piece that I think Allison and I both wanted to share. The State Board of Education held a meeting. This was in 1997, and Henry Jordan, who was a member of the Board of Education, announced that he wanted to put the 10 Commandments on every schoolhouse wall. And when he was sort of rebuffed by the lawyers and everybody around the table at this particular meeting, he said, well, I don't care about other faiths. I only want the Christian faith in American schools, and screw the Buddhists and kill the Muslims.
And put that in the minutes, he said.
Put that in the minutes. That turned out to be just a firestorm in the wake of that. This story came a year later, when we wanted to go in and talk to him and find out what it felt like a year after he had said that, because it dogged him for a long time. Let me read just our lead on this, and Allison can talk about just what it was like to go interview him. This was, of course, he's in Anderson. Even now, A year later, the words trail after Dr. Henry Jordan like vexing, persistent ghost. Screw the Buddhists and kill the Muslims. Even after a public apology, 100 mea culpas and 1,000 prayers, the words hang in the air. 7 words that offended 2 of the world's great religions and gave considerable heartburn to not a few Christians. So
That was
Allison,
Carolyn's read. It was awesome. Um, this was a real challenge of a story to work on. We asked him if we could come up and interview him, spend a day following him around. He agreed, but Carolyn and I both think he agreed more as a okay, bring it on. I'm sure you'll do a hatchet job, but you know, I've been through a year of this, bring it on. So, but that was not our goal. Our goal was to try and understand who this man was, why this issue of the 10 Commandments was so much a part of the public square discussion going on. There were other states that were worrying over this issue. And so we spent a day with him. We spent a couple of weeks working on the story, but we did go up to Anderson for a day, followed him around, talked to him. He was a physician, and we got to talk to one of his patients. We also, one of my favorite stories, I talked to one of his school teachers who had known him in elementary school. And this just, to me, highlighted his impulsiveness. That was just part of who he was. A little girl was sitting in front of him in elementary school, and her ponytail she was flipping her ponytail, and it irritated him. So he just got scissors and cut it off. Which I thought was just felt like the story had been handed to me on this special platter. It's just this most wonderful example. But also we learned in the process of talking to other people that he was the oldest in his family, and when his mother died, he became kind of the caretaker of the family and his brothers. His father was a physician and wasn't home a lot. He had the earnestness of the oldest child, and as an oldest child, I know that can be quite annoying at times. He also cared about his patients. He cared about people. There was a sandwich shop across the street from his office run by a Muslim family, and we talked to them, and they knew him. This is the thing about faith and religion that I think is so it's hard to describe, but I think it's all about relationship. And these people knew him as a person. And so they understood his brashness. They knew he didn't mean this literally. They didn't like it. He had apologized to them. But Henry was somebody who spoke brashly, impulsively, and didn't understand the weight of his words. And it did create a lot of pain for him and his family. The whole thing came about because of a tape of the committee meeting in which it happened. And as somebody teaching journalism students right now, this is something I try to stress to them. There are 2 points in this story that are so important. One, it's that if journalists aren't there in these committee meetings, in these public meetings, and things like this get said, no one knows. And that is why it is so important to have solid, good local journalism. It is also critically important for journalism students to understand the separation of church and state. We are a nation informed by Christian values, but we are a nation that is also informed by many other faith groups' values, which Christians share with them. And it just really concerns me that we be sure our journalism students understand what that really means, the separation of church and state. So, Carolyn, you'll be great about picking that up and
yes,
taking that more.
and when we embarked on this profile, it was really an attempt to sort of peel back the layers of the onion, so to speak. Who is this man that is so impulsive, although of course he said it was just a joke, that he would really offend these religions, and he spent really the year trying to make amends. So we didn't want to go in as although when he invited us up and said, yes, you can come, but he said, I know you'll do a hatchet job on me. So he was already, that just showed the brashness that he had, that bring it on, I don't care. But we really wanted to sort of unveil him, I guess, in a way that explained but did not give him cover, because
Right.
it was an egregious thing to say. A public servant should not do this. And of course, in the era of social media now, this would, within seconds of him saying it, it would be out. But that time, and when somebody taped it, they surreptitiously gave it to a state reporter. So it took a couple of days before it actually landed.
And
I
I
think,
think,
go ahead, Allison.
well, I wanted to be sure about what we may have missed, but I don't want to step on you. So go ahead. What were you
Well,
going to say?
I was thinking, contextualizing is a word we use a lot in journalism, and we said this, what we got right. I think we contextualized this issue in a way that was much more revelatory, I guess. That we wanted to reveal him, but we also wanted to reveal the issues of what happens when people just cavalierly attack in an institution, in this case, two world religions. And because you're in a state that's the buckle of the Bible Belt, no problems. And that just can't happen.
Right. Right. And I think, and I'm not sure how it's not so much that we missed it, but what we couldn't see, what we didn't know was coming. And you have to remember, this is pre 9/11. And so this brewing culture clash or cultural clash that was going to erupt in a few years, to me, this story is part of that, and then got intensified horribly by 9/11, and a lack of religious literacy and religious understanding and tolerance that comes about when these kind of comments are allowed to go without being questioned.
And as someone pointed out in the chat, this was definitely male and class privilege at its height.
Exactly.
His brother served in the legislature at the time, although I think it caused him a lot of heartburn too, having to answer for his brother. So,
Right.
And I love the comment, somebody said the 90s feel like yesterday and a lifetime ago. And I think this story does suggest that.
Absolutely. And the male privilege point is huge. Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next slide. Carolyn is going to start us off with this one as well. This is a great story.
Yes. So many of you may remember Strom Thurmond, but you may not have. He was the longest serving senator and was former governor, really left his imprint on the 20th century in South Carolina. And in the early 2000s, after his death, his mixed race daughter, Essie Mae Washington Williams, came forth to say, Strom Thurmond was my father. She did it after his death because she felt like she didn't want to burden him. But she said her children had encouraged her to go public with the story. The revelation stunned many white South Carolinians, but the Black community had known this story for a long time. And I remember being sent to Edgefield, South Carolina, which is Strom Thurmond's birthplace. And they said, go talk to people on the streets of Edgefield. And every Black person I encountered had known the story for years. And one lady said, oh, my mother told me that a long time ago. Most of the white people said, oh, just kind of boggled their minds. Even some state legislators didn't believe it. Now, to the Thurman family's credit, they embraced her, and of course he had passed away, but his children said yes, the story was true. Um, this story was about Essie Mae Washington Williams' mother, Kerry Butler, who had the liaison with Senator Strom Thurmond when she was 16 years old and he was a young man. She was a servant in the Thurmond household. So, of course, nationally, this was a huge story. It had overtones of Southern white domination. Um, it was really a rewriting of his story in a way. He had been this longtime segregationist, had changed his views on race, but he was known as the standard bearer for the 1948 Dixiecrat campaign and said integration will never happen in the South. So against that backdrop, I had to sort of unveil this woman who was still, I mean, she had died so early and she was a mystery. So let me read just the first couple of paragraphs. I wrote this with Lauren Marco, who was a reporter in Washington. She went to Pennsylvania, where Essie Mae Washington Williams was raised by her aunt, because Kerry Butler had taken the child to Pennsylvania as a little baby. And we couldn't find Kerry Butler's gravestone. We couldn't find anybody who had a memory of her because she had died in the late 30s.
Kerry Butler is the mother of Essie Mae, if it's a little confusing to you.
Yes.
So this is
yes.
the woman who would have had the relationship with Thurman. So, okay, go ahead.
She is a figure lodged mainly in imagination, the subject of hazy anecdotes and faded memory. No photograph of Kerry Butler yet has surfaced, only this compelling mental picture of a tall, willowy black woman making her way down a 1940s era street, teenage daughter in tow, toward the office of J. Strom Thurmond. 6 decades would pass before the daughter, Essie Mae Washington Williams, revealed the details of that scene between Thurmond, soon to be an iconic figure in state politics, and Butler, a maid in the Thurmond house. For Williams, that 1941 meeting was life-altering. On that April day, the 16-year-old discovered she had a white father. He was, she remembers, a tall, handsome man who impressed her that day as cordial and kind. She had told me the story, but never that he was white, Williams said. When I saw him, I was quite surprised. So from that half-hour meeting, a relationship between Essie Mae Washington Williams emerged through the years, and they kept in touch. Strom Thurmond paid for her college to go to South Carolina State, even visited her there when he was governor. And Essie Mae Washington Williams always said that her mother and Strom Thurmond maintained an ongoing relationship, and that it was clandestine, but that it was mutually loving. So I think what we got right in this story is that we excavated that history between whites and blacks in South Carolina, the closeness of it, and how everybody's life is intertwined with each other. I still don't have a picture of Kerry Butler, and none has ever surfaced. Essie Mae did not have one, but she maintained, and Miss Williams has passed away now, but until her death, she maintained that this was a cordial relationship. Feminists, of course, went ballistic over this, and it was really a talker for many years.
Yeah, and very complicated in that arena, because certainly it raises the question that is so obvious, and makes you wonder what sort of power differential there was. And yes, talk about cognitive dissonance, Alexandra. Yes. what we may have missed in addition to, and I don't think we missed that, we knew that, but what we may have missed and would have been, again, kind of like the previous story, hard to get at, is should we have examined the story in the context of systemic racism, even though she did not tell it that way. We felt it was important to let her tell her story. And yet her telling reveals something, I believe, about the nature of race in America. Carolyn, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
Well, I think about this now in terms of the Confederate monuments and other memorials falling now. In my native Virginia, you know, when I worked at UPI, I rode down Monument Avenue early mornings every day to open the bureau, and you know, passed by General Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, and really didn't give it much of a thought, except I did love the horses, the statues, but I didn't really, it would never have crossed my mind back then, and that was in the 80s, to think one day these statues won't be here. So I think about Strom Thurmond's statue on the State House grounds when I pass it too, and I wonder, will there ever be a moment where people say he should be removed? Or is his life so nuanced and complicated, and did he do so much for South Carolina in other regards that he should stay up?
It's a complicated question. Yes, and I noticed somebody mentioned the Strom Thurmond Wellness Center, and
Yes.
There's been a move afoot to get that renamed, and it's a valid question. So, okay, we're going to move into our final notes. I left, before we get here, I left the state newsroom in 2008 and came to work where I am now, which is on staff at St. Martin's in the Fields Episcopal Church. Carolyn left in 2015. The media landscape has changed radically since then. As I mentioned at the beginning, the newsroom that was 150 plus is now, if we're lucky, 30. And because of the pandemic, everybody's working in their silos at home, and they've even closed the state newspaper building out there on Shop Road with hopes of opening a new office downtown after the pandemic. We thought our job at that point, well, first of all, Carolyn, read this quote and tell us about this quote, because this is such a perfect quote for where we are today.
Yes, so this is a quote from William Faulkner. We all read his novels, I'm sure. In a 1955 speech before the Southern Historical Society. 1955, that's 1 year after the passage of the famous 1954 Brown v. Board of Education school desegregation case before the Supreme Court. That year in the South was life-changing and life-altering for, particularly for white people, of course, and Black people had been advocating for at least equal school houses. That was not happening. That became the opening for the NAACP to encourage Black plaintiffs to argue for integration in public schools. So for those of you who may not know, the famous, one of the 5 cases that was rolled into Brown v. Board was in South Carolina, the Briggs v. Elliott school desegregation case out of Clarendon County. And if you think of courage, you need to think of those Briggs plaintiffs who were farmers and shopkeepers and gas station attendants and maids, and many of them lost their jobs because they put their names on a petition asking for integration of schools. So that was very, I think, to have that backdrop. The Southern Historical Society or Association was obviously talking about how the South responds. And I'm not saying that William Faulkner probably was, what he would be in today's mindset, but I think he was saying in this quote, we have got to figure out what's happening in the South. So let me read it to you. It's a little Faulkner-esque, I think, but it gets the point across. We speak now against the day when our Southern people, who will resist to the last these inevitable changes in social relations, will, when they have been forced to accept what they at one time might have accepted with dignity and goodwill, will say, why didn't someone tell us this before? Tell us this in time. So I think that, of course, it's a white perspective quote too. You know, it's interesting that in this speech, he's talking about how white Southerners are going to have to accept the end of Jim Crow.
Right. And that, to me, that quote says so much about what's been happening here this summer in the country. And it's a tragic lament almost. Why didn't someone tell us this before? Well, I believe people were trying to tell us this before. We just weren't willing to hear it. That Briggs v. Elliott case was really just a group of parents. All they wanted initially was a school bus for their children.
Mm-hmm.
Their children walked while the white school children rode past them in a bus. So just the inequity of it all. We had some final thoughts, though, that we thought it would be important to wrap up about how much journalism has changed. Our job was to objectively tell stories and sometimes hard truths about faith and values in this community. We were not, by today's standards, a woke newsroom, meaning a newsroom of advocacy journalists. But many times we were trying to wake people up. We were of the training that you did not become a part of the story, you told the story. And so to be an advocate would have been inappropriate in the training we had had. In South Carolina and in the South, covering these issues together is necessary because they're so intertwined. I think that newsrooms, like every place, evolve over time. It's like I try and have going to be explaining to my students as we move into a phase of our faith and values class where I'm introducing them to different religions, that beyond Christianity, that religions evolve too, and evolve based on the culture in which they are being practiced. So this is why we will encounter different ways of things being practiced or different influences on happening within different faith groups. If you go back to civil rights, some Southern newsrooms ignored civil rights protests in the 40s and 50s and even in the 60s, but that would never occur today. I had my students listen to the words of glory from the film Selma. And because the class is called Faith, Values, and Mass Media, I had a video clip of the march that this song is about. It's a fabulous, beautiful song. And I asked them after they watched it, I said, did you see the media in there? And they just kind of sat there. And I said, did you see the family in their living room with the black and white television just looking stunned at what they were observing of these protests and people being beaten by the police during their walk across the bridge? And then I said, and did you notice the reporters standing on the corner with their notepads? And they had missed it, which probably if they went back and saw it again, they wouldn't have missed it. But we are in a different era where people are using their cell phones to record things. They're not taking notes. It's just a very different era, but truly it was intentional that the civil rights leaders set out intentionally to bring the press to these events, because when it showed up on national television, people could not stop looking. They could not turn away. So I try to impress that upon my students too, about, again, why journalism is so important. and Carolyn, I know you had some things to say, and then I'll mention the point about the social dilemma as well. But.
Yes. So Allison and I are not in a newsroom now, but we are teaching young journalists. And when we talk about we were not in a woke newsroom, well, that language, of course, is talked about among young people, that you have to, in many ways, be an advocate journalist. Uh, and I understand that, and I make way for that, I think. If you want to read an African American journalist who is very thoughtful and philosophical on this, Wesley Lowery, who used to be at the Washington Post. I think he's now at one of the networks, CBS, I think, or he talks about the idea of objectivity and what does that really mean. And his take is that, well, objectivity was always from a white perspective. So if a black journalist says that's not my worldview, and you're having a discussion in the newsroom, it's easier to get dismissed and not pursue those stories. So I think instead of using objectivity, he uses the idea of moral clarity, that we're not robotons. You know, we all come with biases. There's no question about that. You know, Allison and I were told, set aside your biases. But you also, you know, we're not just simply robots. We flesh out stories. We make a decision. We are covering this story. How many reporters are we going to put on this story? So there's subjective arguments and discussions going on every day in newsrooms. And since the George Floyd protest, I think black journalists are really agitating for a greater voice in telling stories in American newsrooms, because it's been, I think they have felt very frustrated by the way we cover issues like police violence and brutality. I think the Washington Post, I think at his and other black journalists' instigation, began tallying the number of black motorists who were killed or injured by police.
Yeah, and I noticed somebody mentioned the value of social media, and I would say yes, there is a value. What I have tried to help my students understand, though, is that social media has no filter. It has no editing, so it's an instantaneous response instead of the response that happens in a newsroom, where you have multiple people thinking through a story and talking about it and determining what would be the best way to get at the story. Who do we send to deal with it? How do we get this covered? Social media is almost like a tip line rather than full-blown stories. And yet, I will say, absolutely, without the cell phone coverage this summer, we would not have had the sea change that we have had. And the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement and the effort toward the country struggling with an understanding of what the police role really is in society and what needs to change there. So yes, there is good and bad. I would encourage, if you have not seen the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, I would encourage you to watch it. They interview tech experts all over the country who have worked for Google, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and it is highly disturbing to hear them describe the deliberate efforts made in technology to addict us to the messages, to move us through their platforms and keep us there. And I worry, as a former journalist and as an American citizen, about what that is doing to our democracy today. So there is great potential for good, and that's one of the things they mentioned in the beginning, all the great things that happened as a result of these platforms. And still, from time to time, these good things are happening, but I think we could all agree a huge amount of polarization is happening because of it right now. And the lack of ability to determine what is, or being savvy takers in of this information, so you can decide, is it fake news or is it real news? So Carolyn, I'll hand it off to you on that one. And
All right, and I'll just, I see we already have a question too, so I wanted
okay,
to
great.
and I'll get to that. I wanted to follow up with what Allison said. You know, every reporter goes into the newsroom and thinks they're reinventing every story, and that's great because I think in the 90s, we were looking back, 90s and 2000s, we were looking back to the civil rights movement and what had changed in South Carolina. And really among sort of not historians, but among sort of the general public, there was a sense that nothing much really happened in South Carolina in civil rights, that it was, you know, everybody was got along and that there was no violence. Well, of course, we have the Orangeburg Massacre in 1968 was really a gash across the soul of South Carolina. And there were plenty of sit-ins. There was a young man from Benedict who got stabbed while he was sitting at one of the dime store drug counters in the 60s. So it's when people say, oh, I don't want to talk about race and religion and all these topics that are, you know, stir the blood, it is important. And that's what our role is as journalists, to do that. Allison, the question we had was, do we think that the, whoops, I think it popped up. Do we think that the Heritage Act is encouraging or promoting racism?
Oh, that's a good one. Do I get to answer this personally? Yes, I think it is. I think it is. But I also think if we're going to have monuments to honor our history, they need to be done in context. I think we need to understand, if we're going to keep monuments, we need to explain why they are there, when they went up. If you will notice the dates of when many of these monuments went up, it was not right after the Civil War. It was after Reconstruction. And so there was a message there. The same message that Lonnie Randolph was worried about when he said, no, that flag is still flying in my face. So I think it would serve us so much better to come to a better solution than the Heritage Act. Now, Carolyn, I don't know what you might want to add to that.
Well, South Carolinians always pride themselves on making decisions at the local level, and I think maybe if we return that to counties, they might be able to make their own decisions. I think the city of Columbia, Dr. Sims' statue would be off the State House grounds if Mayor Benjamin had his way. So right. I think that might be a helpful way, have people at the local level decide that too.
And at the very least, to provide the whole story at the monument, not just one side of the story.
Right.
So, yeah.
Here's a question when we talked about the social dilemma. How can we help ourselves and our students to be better consumers of news? Ooh,
good one.
That is, you know, I find my students don't really like to read. They like to skim, and they're skimming through their tweets, and they know breaking news. They know what's happening, but I've encouraged them to go back and read more deeply on issues to background themselves, because really even going back to original sources helps people understand.
And I think we also need to take advantage of resources that are out there. And I'm sorry I don't have a link for you right now, but the Episcopal Church at the national level has an entire page on its website dedicated to how to be a savvy consumer, how to be politically well informed. And that is not to say that you get informed in one direction or another. That would be against church and state. But the role is to be sure you are doing these things to be well informed before you cast your vote, for example. And they actually have on that website a test that you can take to see how well you do in reading different types of social media and determining whether it's real news or fake news. And it's a great example, and it was actually very hard. When I know some of the things you look for are bad capitalizations, bad spellings, odd ways of referencing things that don't sound quite right. But I'm telling you, some of these are so close, it is very tricky to determine. So I leave it at, I think those are some ways to be better informed as you're perusing through your social media, and to get rid of some things. If you just don't, if your gut tells you this doesn't feel right, find a way to get that app or that source off of your phone.
And there is a question that is related to this. What is the best source for unbiased, concise news? I'll tell you what I read every day, and I'm not saying that all of these would be totally unbiased, but I read what we now call the legacy newspapers. I hate to say that. Washington Post, New York Times, for the largest stories. Of course, I read the local newspapers here and scan the television websites. I go to Axios, which is a Mike Allen website, and he is really trying to do brevity and conciseness out of Washington. My husband actually subscribes to this website called The Writing. I think it's Rightting, and that is from the right point of view. And they put they just actually gather stories from all right viewpoint periodicals and put them together. So you really get a different point of view. You know, I watch cable because I think it's interesting, but I don't, you know, I know if I watch CNN and then I flip to Fox, I'm going to have cognitive dissonance for sure. So I don't rely on those.
Right. Yeah. I also think NPR and public broadcasting can be good,
Yes.
solid sources. And you just need to be, you just have to pay attention to the biases that may be present. But the big papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, Miami Herald, Chicago, these papers have the resources to cover stories the way they need to be covered. And so it's worth spending some time and money on those, in my opinion. And just reading other books about things, like Carolyn was saying. Isabel Wilkerson is a wonderful source on race in America right now. And there are many other people, Ta-Nehisi Coates. There are many others, but I definitely recommend both of them.
One of our participants recommended allsides.com.
Okay.
You know what you were buying. That's good. And as Avery mentioned, ask me to repeat what I said. It's called The Writing, TheRighting.com. And it says, alerting liberal audiences to today's headlines from the right. So it's, you know, try to get as many viewpoints as you can. Here's a question that's really interesting. Do you think the focus on larger issues like a systemic racism could damage the stories of people like Washington Williams? Could the larger issue overshadow the individual? That's a great question. You know, I think it has to be a mix of, we can't eliminate her voice. Her voice was powerful. And I suspect if you ask her children and grandchildren what they thought, they would have a different point of view. I think generationally, things are changing so fast that her willingness to wait till after her father passed away, you know, was a personal decision. I don't think it was based on her race. That was just really it was a heart-based decision. But but I don't think her grandchildren who, never got to really meet him, or great-grandchildren, would have that compunction.
I agree. I think so. And I think um, I think it's a risk you have to take. I mean, we can't just want to keep the old story intact. I just think these stories will evolve as more and more understanding and enlightenment comes to culture, to society. And my belief is that we're strong enough to take it. We're big enough to take it, and we can make society can be better for having this deeper understanding of our brokenness, as well as our capacity um, uh, for healing and for a broader appreciation for who we all are. Not to be Pollyanna, but I just believe that we're capable of that, and we shouldn't be afraid.
And I think journalists, we are often castigated, tagged as liberals, and fake news now, of course. But I would not say we're liberal. I would say we're progressive, and that we are in this business because we believe in the progression of humanity. And
Exactly.
when people say, when you see a situation like the killing of George Floyd, and you don't have an innate human horror at that, well, then we do have to do some work in society. And we do have to bring it up. And it is difficult. Uh, I can't tell you how many times people would email me and say, I wish you all would stop talking about race and religion, because, that's our private business. But it's a public business, and, you don't change people's minds or make them become more thoughtful Americans, which is really what we try to do in journalism, without having difficult conversations.
And I think that's very evident in the Breonna Taylor story too, because of so many complications with that story. And you run the risk, what I have noticed, of judging her and almost without recognizing that she was a human being. And all I could think of was, if this had been my daughter, I would fight to the end for justice in her name, even if she had potentially been involved in some things that were not in her best interest. My understanding of her is that she was working very hard to change her life, and the whole thing erupted because the boyfriend was afraid that this other element was coming in to do them harm. And so I think we need greater empathy in all of this understanding. And I often think it's best if we think, well, what would I do if that were my child? How would I feel if that were my father? Uh, I think it forces you to think of things differently.
I think we all remember To Kill a Mockingbird and Atticus Finch's admonition to scout, walk in someone else's shoes. And that's what we try to do in journalism. That's what we've tried to do in each story we tackled. Sometimes we were successful, sometimes we weren't. But we went into it with a real desire to illuminate and educate.